The prison transport ship cut through the darkness of space like a blade through silk, and Commander Lyria stood at the observation window of Station Arcturus, watching it approach with growing unease that she could not explain. Her dragon Ember sensed her discomfort and lifted his crimson head from where he had been coiled around the support beam overhead, and the ancient creature projected feelings of curiosity, mixed with concern, directly into her mind, through the bond they had shared. For 70 years, Lyria was an elf who had served the Galactic Council for 3 centuries, and she had risen through the ranks by following orders without question and by never allowing personal feelings to interfere with duty. But something about this particular transport made her skin prickle with warning. The manifest on her datapad showed only basic information about the incoming prisoner, and the name listed was Katie Morgan, and the charges were unauthorized travel through restricted space and attempted breach of quarantine protocols, but the details were oddly sparse, and several sections had been sealed under Council security clearance that even Lyria could not access. Station Arcturus orbited a dead moon in the outer sectors, where the Galactic Council maintained its most secure detention facility for prisoners deemed too dangerous or too politically sensitive for regular confinement, and Lyria had commanded the station for 40 years, without ever questioning why. Certain prisoners arrived with sealed files and departed to locations no one would discuss. The transport docked with a metallic clang that echoed through the station corridors, and Lyria made her way to the receiving bay where guards in black armor waited to process the new arrival, and she noticed they carried neural staffs capable of delivering pain that could break even the strongest will. The airlock opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and 2 guards emerged dragging a human woman. Between them and the woman wore the standard gray prisoner uniform and heavy chains, connected her wrists to her ankles, forcing her to take small, shuffling steps. Katie Morgan looked younger than Lyria had expected, perhaps in her mid-30s by human standards, and she had brown hair that hung in tangled waves past her shoulders and green eyes that seemed to burn with an intensity that made Lyria uncomfortable, because prisoners usually arrived broken and defeated. But this human showed no fear. The neural collar around Katie's neck blinked with a steady red light indicating it was active and ready to deliver punishment at the touch of a button, and Lyria had seen such collars used on violent criminals and war criminals, but never on someone charged with simple travel violations. One of the transport guards handed Lyria a data chip and told her in clipped tones that the prisoner was to be held in maximum security isolation until a council representative arrived for interrogation, and that under no circumstances was anyone to speak with her beyond what was necessary for basic processing. Lyria took the chip and nodded, but something in the guard's tone made her wonder what the council feared from one unarmed human woman, and why they had sent her to the most secure facility in the outer sectors when standard protocol would have placed her in a regular detention center closer to human space. The guards hauled Katie toward the detention wing, and Lyria followed at a distance, watching the way the human held her head high despite the chains and the way her eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the corridor, as if memorizing escape routes. Though escape from Station Arcturus was considered impossible, Ember swooped down from the ceiling and landed on Lyria's shoulder with a gentle thump, and his scales were warm against her neck, and he projected an image into her mind of the human woman surrounded by a soft golden glow that dragons use to indicate truth and innocence. Lyria frowned because she trusted Ember's instincts more than any scanner or interrogation device, and dragons had lived for thousands of years before bonding with elves, and they possessed an ancient wisdom that could see through lies to the heart of a person's true nature. The guard shoved Katie into a cell that was little more than a metal box with a sleeping platform and a basic sanitation unit, and they activated the force field that sealed her inside, and one guard punched a code into the control panel that caused the neural collar to deliver a brief shock that made Katie gasp and stumble. Lyria felt anger flash through her at the unnecessary cruelty, but she kept her expression neutral and dismissed the transport guards, and once they were gone, she stood before Katie's cell studying the human who had sat down on the sleeping platform and was rubbing her neck where the collar had burned her skin. Katie looked up and met Lyria's eyes, and for a long moment neither spoke, and then the human said in a quiet voice that carried surprising strength that she supposed it was pointless to ask for help, but that she needed to reach Sector 9 where her daughter was trapped behind the quarantine. Lyria knew about Sector 9, because everyone in the galaxy knew about the plague that had swept through 12 worlds 3 years ago, killing millions, and the Council had responded by sealing the entire sector and forbidding anyone from entering or leaving, and they had declared the survivors acceptable losses. The quarantine had been controversial because many believed the Council could have sent aid and medical supplies without risking contamination, but the Council had decided that the risk was too great and that it was better to let the plague burn itself out, even if it meant condemning hundreds of thousands to slow death. Katie explained that her daughter Megan had been visiting a research station on one of the affected worlds when the quarantine went into effect, and that for 2 years Katie had tried every legal avenue to get permission to reach her child, and that when all legal options failed, she had decided to break the law. She had sold everything she owned to buy passage on a smuggler ship that claimed to know a way through the quarantine defenses, and she had made it 3 sectors away before patrol ships intercepted her and arrested her. And now she sat in a cell while her daughter waited alone and afraid on a dying world. Lyria listened without interrupting, and she recognized the desperation in Katie's voice because she had heard that same tone from parents throughout the galaxy whose children had been caught in wars or disasters or bureaucratic nightmares and who would do anything to save them. When Katie finished speaking, she looked at Lyria with eyes that held no hope, because she had already tried pleading with dozens of officials and guards, and no one had been willing to risk their career or their freedom. To help one human woman save one human child, Lyria should have walked away and followed protocol and waited for the Council representative to arrive and conduct the official interrogation. But instead she stood there feeling Ember's warmth against her shoulder and remembering a time centuries ago when she had believed the Council existed to protect people, not to write them off as acceptable losses. She told Katie that she could not promise anything, but that she would review the case file, and Katie nodded slowly as if she had expected nothing more. And Lyria turned and walked away, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of service pressing down on her like chains far heavier than the ones Katie wore. That night, Lyria sat in her quarters, with Ember curled around her chair, and she pulled up Katie's file on her secure terminal and began reading through the sparse information. And she noticed immediately that key details were missing and that the timeline did not make sense. The file claimed Katie had been arrested near the border of Sector 7, but the smuggler ship she had hired operated out of Sector 3, which meant she should have been intercepted much earlier unless someone had been tracking her and waiting for her to get close enough to the quarantine that her intentions were clear. Lyria dug deeper using command codes that gave her access to patrol logs and communication records, and she discovered that Katie's arrest had been flagged as priority by someone high in the Council bureaucracy, and that orders had been given to make an example of her. She found references to other humans who had attempted to breach the quarantine, and all of them had been sentenced to penal colonies in the dead zones where prisoners mined radioactive minerals until their bodies gave out, and none of them had ever been heard from. Again, Ember projected feelings of sadness and anger through their bond because dragons understood injustice better than most species, and they remembered a time before the Council when beings settled their differences through honest conflict rather than bureaucratic cruelty. Lyria closed the file and sat in darkness thinking about duty and orders and the slow erosion of principles that happened when good people did nothing, and she wondered if she had the courage to risk everything she had built, or if she would become just another official who looked away while innocent people suffered. Morning arrived on Station Arcturus, with artificial daylight that flooded through the reinforced windows, and Lyria woke from restless sleep filled with dreams of crying children and locked doors that would not open no matter how hard she pushed. Ember had not left her side during the night, and his presence was a comfort, because the dragon had been with her through countless battles and peacekeeping missions, and he knew her heart better than she knew herself sometimes. She dressed in her formal commander uniform with its silver insignia that marked her rank and status, and she made her way to the detention wing where Katie Morgan sat in her cell, staring at the blank metal walls with eyes that held the exhaustion of someone who had not truly slept in years. Lyria had decided during the long night that she would conduct her own interrogation before the Council representative arrived, because she needed to hear the full story directly from Katie without filters or official transcripts that could be edited to support whatever narrative the Council preferred. She deactivated the force field and stepped into the cell. and Katie looked up with surprise because prisoners were never allowed direct contact with. The commander and Lyria sat down on the sleeping platform, leaving enough space to seem non-threatening. She told Katie that she wanted to hear everything about her daughter, and about what had happened when the quarantine went into effect, and about the 2 years of fighting bureaucracy that had led to this desperate illegal attempt to breach the sealed sector. Katie hesitated at first because she had learned not to trust officials, but something in Lyria's face, or perhaps Ember's presence, made her decide to speak openly, and she began telling her story in a quiet voice that occasionally broke with emotion. Her daughter, Megan, had been 16 when she won a scholarship to study xenobiology at a research station on Valterra Prime in Sector 9, and it was supposed to be a 6-month program that would open doors for her future. And Katie had been so proud watching her brilliant daughter board the transport. 3 months into the program, the plague appeared, and it spread with terrifying speed, killing thousands within days, and the council acted swiftly, sealing the entire sector before anyone understood what was happening or had time to evacuate. Katie had been on Earth when the quarantine went into effect, and she received a brief transmission from Megan saying the research station was being converted to a refugee shelter, and that supplies were running low, and that she was scared, but trying to help the medical staff treat the sick. That transmission was the last direct communication Katie received because the council shut down all channels into Sector 9, claiming they needed to prevent panic and misinformation. But Katie believed they simply did not want the rest of the galaxy to see what was happening to the people they had abandoned. For 6 months, Katie followed proper channels and filed applications for emergency passage, and she contacted her government representatives, and she joined advocacy groups pushing for humanitarian aid. But every request was denied, and every petition was ignored. She sold her house and used the money to hire lawyers who filed lawsuits challenging the quarantine on humanitarian grounds. But the courts ruled that the council had authority to take extreme measures during plague emergencies, and that individual hardship did not outweigh collective safety. Katie took a job working triple shifts to save money while spending every free moment searching for alternative ways to reach her daughter, and she discovered underground networks of people trying to breach the quarantine and smugglers who claimed to know gaps in the defense grid. Most of these leads were scams run by criminals who preyed on desperate families. But Katie investigated them all anyway because she could not afford to miss any real opportunity, no matter how slim. She found sporadic updates about conditions in Sector 9 through hackers who broke into council medical databases, and what she learned made her sick with fear, because supplies had run out months ago, and people were dying not just from the plague but from starvation and preventable diseases. The reports mentioned a refugee camp on Valterra Prime where survivors from the research station had gathered, and Katie convinced herself that Megan was there waiting and hoping that someone would come, because a mother could not accept any other possibility. 18 months after the quarantine began, Katie made contact with a smuggler named Chen, who claimed his ship had stealth technology that could slip past the automated defense platforms that guarded Sector 9, and he quoted a price that took everything Katie had saved, plus money she borrowed from friends who probably knew they would never be repaid. She sold her furniture and her car and her deceased mother's jewelry, and she took out loans she had no hope of repaying, and she gathered the full amount and met Chen at a spaceport on the edge of human-controlled space. The journey toward Sector 9 took weeks because they had to avoid patrol routes and stick to backwater systems where council presence was minimal. And Katie spent those weeks in a cargo hold barely larger than her cell, planning what she would say to Megan when they finally reunited but 3 sectors away from their destination. Alarms began blaring, and Chen cursed and told Katie they had been made, and that patrol ships were closing fast, and he tried to run, but the council ships were faster and better armed. Katie was arrested and Chen disappeared into the prison system, and Katie found herself in chains being transported to Station Arcturus while her daughter remained trapped and unreachable behind walls of council bureaucracy and automated weapons. She finished her story and looked at Lyria with eyes that held no tears because she had cried them all out months ago, and she said quietly that she understood she would probably never see Megan again, but that she needed Lyria to know her daughter was real and was waiting and deserved better than to be forgotten. Lyria sat in silence, processing everything she had heard, and Ember projected images into her mind of a young human girl with Katie's green eyes, huddled in a shelter surrounded by sick and dying people, and the dragon included feelings of deep sadness mixed with anger at injustice. She asked Katie if she had any proof that Megan was still alive, and Katie pulled a data chip from a hidden pocket in her uniform and explained that it contained the last transmission she had received from Sector 9 6 months ago. Lyria took the chip and inserted it into her personal data pad, and a grainy video appeared, showing a makeshift medical ward filled with cots and a young girl with brown hair, and Katie's eyes was visible in the background, helping distribute water to patients. The timestamp confirmed the video was recent, and Lyria felt something crack in the armor of professional detachment she had worn for 3 centuries, because this was not an abstract policy debate about quarantine protocols, but a real child suffering real consequences of decisions made by people who would never have to live with them. She told Katie that a council representative was arriving tomorrow and that he would conduct the official interrogation, and that Katie would almost certainly be sentenced to a penal colony. And Katie nodded because she had expected nothing less. But then Lyria did something she had never done in 300 years of service, and she told Katie that she was going to review all the data she had on Sector 9 and study the quarantine defense grid and see if there was any truth to the rumors about gaps in the automated platforms. Katie's head snapped up and hope flared in her eyes, for the first time since her arrest, and she started to speak. But Lyria held up a hand and warned her not to hope too much, because even if a gap existed, using it would be illegal, and helping Katie escape would end Lyria's career and possibly her life. She stood and walked toward the cell door, and Katie called after her, asking why an elf commander who had everything would risk anything for one human. She barely knew. Lyria paused and turned back, and she said simply that she had a mother too, who had died centuries ago, and that she remembered what it felt like to be loved that fiercely, and that some things mattered more than orders. She reactivated the force field and left the detention wing, and Ember swooped along beside her, projecting approval and determination through their bond, because dragons understood that true honor sometimes meant breaking rules that had become tools of cruelty rather than justice. Lyria returned to her quarters and began pulling up classified files on the Sector 9 quarantine, and she studied defense grid patterns and patrol schedules and automated platform specifications, looking for weaknesses that might exist. Hours passed, and her eyes grew tired from staring at screens, but she continued, searching because she had made a promise and because somewhere in Sector 9, a girl named Megan waited for a mother who would never stop fighting to reach her. The council representative arrived exactly when scheduled, and Councillor Theron was everything Lyria had learned to distrust about the upper levels of galactic bureaucracy, with his perfect silver hair and expensive robes and smile that never reached his cold eyes. He swept into the station with an entourage of personal guards and assistants, and he barely acknowledged Lyria beyond a curt nod before demanding to be taken to the prisoner immediately. Lyria led him to the detention wing and watched through the observation window as Theron entered Katie's cell and began his interrogation with questions designed not to discover truth, but to build a case for the harshest possible punishment. Katie answered each question honestly, and she explained again about her daughter and the desperate need to reach her before it was too late. But Theron showed no interest in her motivations and kept steering the conversation back to her illegal actions and her disrespect for council authority. The interrogation lasted 2 hours, and when it ended, Theron emerged from the cell looking satisfied, and he told Lyria that he would be recommending immediate transfer to the mining colonies in the dead zones where Katie would serve out her natural life in hard labor. Lyria asked if there were no consideration for extenuating circumstances, and Theron looked at her with barely concealed contempt and said that the law existed to prevent chaos, and that showing mercy to one desperate parent would encourage thousands of others to break quarantine protocols. He added that the council needed to send a clear message that personal feelings could not override public safety, and that Katie Morgan would serve as that message. And then he swept out of the detention wing, trailed by his entourage, leaving Lyria standing alone with Ember. That night Lyria made her decision, and she knew it would cost her everything, but she also knew she could not live with herself if she stood by and did nothing while an innocent woman was sent to die in the mines for the crime of loving her daughter. She had found what she was looking for in the defense grid specifications, and there was a gap in the automated platforms that opened for exactly 4 hours every 3 weeks when maintenance protocols cycled through system updates, and the gap would occur in 2 days. The gap was small, and a ship would need to be fast and equipped with stealth technology to slip through before the platforms came back online, but Lyria had access to a prototype courier ship that met those requirements. She went to Katie's cell and deactivated the force field, and the human looked up in surprise as Lyria entered and said they needed to talk quickly and quietly. Lyria explained about the gap in the defense grid and about the courier ship, and about the narrow window of opportunity that would exist in 48 hours. And Katie listened with growing amazement, and then asked the question Lyria had been dreading. Why would an elf commander throw away 3 centuries of service to help one human? She barely knew. Lyria sat down and was quiet for a long moment before answering, and she told Katie about her mother who had raised her alone after Lyria's father died in a border conflict and who had worked 3 jobs to give Lyria opportunities for education and advancement. She told Katie about the day her mother collapsed from exhaustion, and the doctors said there was nothing they could do, and about how Lyria had begged the Council for emergency medical transport to a facility with better equipment, but they had denied her request, saying resources could not be diverted for one person. Her mother died while Lyria sat in a waiting room filling out forms that nobody read, and from that day forward, Lyria had sworn to serve the Council, believing that by working within the system, she could prevent others from suffering the same injustice. But 300 years later, she realized the system had not changed and that it still sacrificed individuals for abstract principles, and that all her service had achieved nothing except making her complicit in the very injustice she had sworn to fight. Katie reached out and touched Lyria's hand and said quietly that helping her escape would not bring back Lyria's mother, and Lyria agreed, but said it might help her sleep again without dreaming of locked doors. They spent the next day planning every detail of the escape, and Lyria used her command access to study guard schedules and security protocols, and she identified a maintenance corridor that would take them from the detention wing to the hangar, without passing through monitored checkpoints. She arranged for Ember's twin sister Ash, who was bonded to Lyria's second officer, to create false sensor readings that would show Katie still in her cell for several hours after the escape, giving them time to reach the courier ship. The courier ship was equipped with medical supplies and rations and navigation, data that would take Katie through the gap and directly to Valterra Prime, where intelligence reports confirmed the refugee camp still existed. Lyria loaded extra supplies into the cargo hold, working alone during the night shift when the hangar was empty. And she felt her heart's pounding because every action she took now was treason, and discovery would mean death. Ember stayed close, providing comfort and projecting confidence through their bond. And he reminded her that dragons had lived for thousands of years watching civilizations rise and fall, and that they judged beings not by their obedience to laws, but by their courage to do what was right. The day of the escape arrived, and Lyria went through her normal routine, as if nothing was different, and she conducted station business and filed reports and had a brief meeting with Counselor Theron, who informed her that Katie's transfer to the penal colony would occur the following morning. When the night shift began, Lyria made her way to the detention wing, and she used her command codes to disable the security systems one by one, creating a window of opportunity that would last exactly 30 minutes. She entered Katie's cell and removed the neural collar and handed the human a maintenance uniform that would help her blend in if they encountered anyone in the corridors. They moved quickly through the maintenance passages, and Ash flew ahead scouting for patrols, while Ember brought up the rear ready to use his fire breath if they were discovered. The journey to the hangar took 15 minutes, and Lyria's nerves were stretched tight, because every moment increased the risk that someone would notice the disabled security systems or check Katie's cell and sound the alarm. They reached the hangar without incident, and Lyria led Katie to the courier ship and began the launch sequence while explaining the navigation system and emergency protocols. Katie climbed into the pilot's seat and looked at the controls, with determination mixed with fear because she was not a trained pilot, but she had studied flight manuals during her months of preparation, and desperation would have to substitute for experience. Lyria handed her the data chip with the coordinates and the timetable for the gap in the defense grid, and she told Katie to fly straight and fast and not to stop for anything no matter what happened. Katie started to thank her, but Lyria cut her off and said there was no time, and that every second counted, and that when Katie found Megan, she should tell her daughter that even in a galaxy of cold bureaucracy, there were still people who believed love mattered more than rules. The courier ship lifted off and slipped through the hangar force field and accelerated into the darkness of space, and Lyria stood watching it disappear into the starfield, feeling Ember press against her side in silent support. She knew alarms would begin sounding soon, and that her actions would be discovered, and that she would face trial and execution. But in that moment, watching Katie speed toward her daughter, she felt more at peace than she had in 3 centuries. Ember projected an image into her mind of a mother and daughter reuniting and holding each other while tears of joy streamed down their faces, and the dragon included feelings of pride and love, because he knew his bonded partner had finally remembered who she was, beneath all the uniforms and ranks. Lyria returned to her quarters and sat down to wait for the inevitable arrest, and she thought about her own mother and hoped that wherever her spirit existed, it could see what Lyria had done and understand that she had finally learned the lesson her mother tried to teach all those years ago, that some things were worth more than safety or status or even life itself, and that the measure of a person was not in their obedience to authority, but in their willingness to sacrifice everything for what they knew was right. Alarms began exactly 3 hours later, and Lyria heard boots pounding through corridors as guards rushed to discover what had happened, and she stood calmly and walked to her door, knowing what came next, and accepting it without regret. The guards came for Lyria with weapons drawn as if she might resist or try to escape, though both of them knew she would do neither because she had made her choice, and she would face the consequences with the same calm she had shown throughout 3 centuries of service. They bound her wrists with energy cuffs that burned against her skin with cold fire, and they stripped her of her command insignia and her uniform jacket, leaving her in the plain gray undershirt that marked her as just another prisoner counselor. Theron arrived within the hour, and his face was twisted with fury that someone under his authority had dared to defy council orders, and he began shouting questions about where Katie had gone and what route she was taking, and when the gap in the defense grid would close. Lyria met his eyes without fear and told him calmly that she had helped Katie Morgan escape to reach her daughter, and that she would not provide any information that might help him stop the human from completing her journey. Theron struck her across the face with the back of his hand, and the blow split her lip, but Lyria did not flinch, and her steady gaze seemed to infuriate him more than any words could have. He ordered her taken to the detention wing and locked in the same cell where Katie had been held, and Lyria walked there with her head high, while Ember flew overhead crying out in distress because dragons could not be imprisoned alongside their bonded partners, but were held separately. The guards threw Lyria into the cell and activated the force field, and then they brought Ember and Ash to the detention level and locked them in energy cages designed to contain dragon fire, and the sight of the magnificent creatures trapped and helpless made several guards look away in shame. Theron returned an hour later, and he told Lyria that patrol ships had been dispatched to intercept Katie before she reached Sector 9, and that even if she made it through the gap, the defense platforms on the other side would destroy her ship. He said that Lyria's sacrifice had been meaningless, and that Katie would die alone in the void, and that her daughter would never know how close rescue had come, and he watched Lyria's face carefully, looking for signs of despair or regret. But Lyria smiled instead, because she had studied the patrol deployment schedules, and she knew the fastest ships were on the other side of the sector and would take hours to reach the intercept point, and by then Katie would already be through the gap. She told Theron this, and watched satisfaction drain from his face, as he realized she had planned everything carefully, and that his patrol ships would arrive too late, and that there was nothing he could do to stop one determined human mother from reaching her child. Theron ordered an immediate trial to take place the next morning, and he contacted the council to request permission for summary execution, and Lyria knew this meant they feared her example might inspire others to question their authority. That night she lay on the metal sleeping platform staring at the ceiling, while Ember and Ash breathed flames in their cages, creating patterns of light and shadow on the walls, and through their bond, she felt the dragon sending her strength and love. She thought about Katie speeding through space toward the gap, and she hoped the human had enough skill to navigate the narrow window and make it through before the automated platforms came back online. She thought about a girl named Megan, waiting in a refugee camp, not knowing that her mother had crossed half the galaxy and broken every law and sacrificed everything to reach her. She thought about her own mother who had died alone in a waiting room while bureaucrats shuffled papers, and she understood finally that her 3 centuries of service had been an attempt to make sense of that senseless death. But serving, a system that valued order over compassion, had not honored her mother's memory, and instead it had made Lyria complicit in creating more victims like Katie and Megan, who suffered because the powerful found it convenient to sacrifice them. The trial began at dawn in a courtroom that was empty except for 3 judges who had already decided her fate, and Counselor Theron, who presented evidence of her crimes with theatrical flourish. He displayed security footage of Lyria disabling systems and leading Katie through maintenance corridors and loading the courier ship. And he read command logs showing how she had accessed classified information about the defense grid. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, and Lyria did not bother trying to defend herself because there was no defense under council law for what she had done. Instead, when given the chance to speak, she told the judges exactly why she had helped Katie escape, and she spoke about mothers and daughters, and the duty of the powerful to protect the vulnerable, rather than sacrifice them for convenience. She said that laws existed to serve people, not the other way around, and that any system that punished love and rewarded bureaucratic cruelty had lost its moral authority. The judges listened with stone faces, and when she finished speaking, the chief judge pronounced her guilty of treason and conspiracy and violations of quarantine protocols, and sentenced her to death by neural disintegration. Neural disintegration was the worst death the council could impose because it did not just end life, but erased the pattern of consciousness so completely that there could be no rebirth or afterlife or continuation. In any form, it was a death reserved for the worst traitors, and Theron had specifically requested it as punishment for Lyria's defiance, and as a warning to anyone else who might consider putting personal loyalty above council authority. Lyria accepted the sentence without emotion, and the judges ordered execution to take place the following dawn, and she was returned to her cell to spend her last night saying goodbye to Ember through their bond. The dragon projected images of their decades together, and the battles they had fought, and the worlds they had saved, and he told her that she had lived with honor and that she would die the same way. Ash added her own farewell, and both dragons promised they would remember and would tell Lyria's story to any who would listen, and would wait for a time when the galaxy needed heroes brave enough to stand against injustice. Lyria thanked them, and told them she had no regrets, except that she would not live to know if Katie had reached Megan, and if the reunion she had sacrificed everything to make possible had actually happened. That night she did not sleep, but instead sat watching the stars through the narrow window in her cell, and she thought about all the lives she had touched during 3 centuries and hoped that her final act would be remembered as her truest one. Morning came too quickly, and guards arrived to escort her to the execution chamber, and they walked through corridors filled with station personnel who had served under her command, and many of them stood at attention as she passed, showing respect despite her conviction. The execution chamber was a sterile white room, dominated by a metal platform surrounded by neural array projectors that would fire simultaneously and unmake her consciousness piece by piece. Technicians strapped her to the platform and calibrated the equipment, while Counselor Theron watched from the observation window, and she could see Ember and Ash in their cages pressed against the energy barriers, crying out in distress. The chief technician asked if she had any final words, and Lyria thought for a moment before speaking, and she said that she hoped Katie had reached her daughter, and that she hoped someday the council would learn that compassion was not weakness but the highest form of strength. Theron activated the intercom and told her mockingly that patrol ships had been dispatched, and that even if Katie had made it through the gap, there were defense platforms waiting on the other side that would destroy any unauthorized vessel. But Lyria smiled because she had studied those platforms too, and she knew their firing patterns and response times, and she had given Katie detailed evasion protocols that would help her dodge their targeting systems long enough to reach planetary atmosphere. She told Theron this and watched his face darken with rage as he realized she had been 3 steps ahead of him throughout the entire operation, and that his attempts to catch Katie had been futile from the start. The technician began the final countdown, and Lyria closed her eyes and reached through her bond to Ember one last time, and felt the dragon's love flooding through her like warm sunlight. She thought of her mother and of Katie and of Megan and of all the people throughout history who had sacrificed everything for love, and she understood that she was part of something larger than herself. The neural array began to hum with building power, and Lyria took a deep breath and prepared for the neural array fired, and Lyria felt her consciousness begin to fragment as the projectors worked systematically to erase every pattern that made her who she was, and the pain was beyond anything she had experienced in 3 centuries. But she held on to one final thought of Katie reaching Megan and reuniting mother and daughter. Through the bond she felt Ember's agony as the dragon experienced her death through their connection, and she tried to send him comfort and gratitude for 70 years of loyal companionship. But the neural disintegration was tearing her apart too quickly. In those final seconds before complete erasure, Lyria saw her mother's face smiling with approval, and she heard her mother's voice saying that she had finally learned the lesson that love was the only thing worth dying for. Then the neural array reached full power, and Commander Lyria ceased to exist, and her pattern was scattered into nothing. And in their cages, Ember and Ash screamed with rage and grief as they felt their bonded partner disappear forever. The technicians powered down the equipment, and Counselor Theron stood in the observation window looking satisfied that justice had been served and that the Council had sent its message to anyone who might consider defying their authority. But in a distant part of space, Katie Morgan was piloting the courier ship through the narrow gap in the defense grid, and her hands were steady on the controls despite her lack of training because desperation and 2 years of planning had given her skills she never knew she possessed. The automated platforms detected her ship and began firing, but Katie followed Lyria's evasion protocols exactly, and she dodged the targeting systems long enough to punch through into Sector 9 where the defense grid was less comprehensive. Warning alarms screamed as she entered atmosphere on Valtera Prime, and the ship shuddered from stress. But Katie kept it together through sheer force of will, and she followed the coordinates Lyria had given her to the refugee camp. The landing was rough, and the courier ship skidded across dirt and rocks before coming to rest near a cluster of makeshift shelters where survivors stared at the unexpected arrival with mixture of hope and fear. Katie stumbled from the ship and began asking everyone she saw about a girl named Megan Morgan, who had come from the research station, and for agonizing minutes no one knew anything until an older woman pointed toward a medical tent. Katie ran, and her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst, and she pushed through the tent flap and saw rows of sick people lying on cots and medical staff working with inadequate supplies trying to save lives that the Council had written off. And there in the back of the tent, distributing water from a battered container, was a girl with brown hair and green eyes who looked up at the sound of someone entering and froze when she saw Katie standing there. For a heartbeat, neither moved because Megan could not believe her eyes and Katie could not speak past the lump in her throat. And then Megan dropped the water container and ran, and they met in the middle and held each other while tears streamed down both their faces. They stood there for long minutes just holding on and crying and whispering each other's names, and around them medical staff paused in their work and smiled because even in this place of death and suffering, love still found a way. Katie pulled back finally and looked at her daughter, who had grown taller and thinner and older than any 18-year-old should look. And she saw the exhaustion and trauma in Megan's eyes, but also the strength that had kept her going through 2 years of hell. Megan asked how Katie had gotten through the quarantine, and Katie started to explain about the smuggler and the arrest and the elf commander who had sacrificed everything to help one human mother reach her daughter. Told Megan about Lyria's courage and kindness, and about the price the elf had paid for defying the Council. And Megan listened with tears falling fresh, because she understood what that sacrifice meant. Katie said they needed to leave quickly because Council patrols would eventually come looking for the ship, and they could not waste the gift Lyria had given them. But Megan looked around at the medical tent full of dying people, and she said quietly that they could not leave when the courier ship was filled with medical supplies that could save dozens of lives. Katie understood immediately because her daughter had always had a generous heart, and she realized that running now would dishonor Lyria's sacrifice, which had been about more than just saving one person, but about standing against a system that abandoned the vulnerable. They unloaded the medical supplies, and Katie showed the medical staff how to use the advanced equipment, and she explained that more help might come if they could get word out about conditions in the camp. Over the following days, Katie and Megan worked alongside the survivors, treating the sick and organizing supply distribution, and slowly people began to recover, and hope returned to a place that had known only despair. Katie used the courier ship's communication system to send messages beyond the quarantine, and she uploaded videos showing conditions in the camp and listing names of survivors, and her transmissions were picked up by independent journalists who began broadcasting them across the galaxy. The images of sick children and exhausted medical staff and people dying from preventable diseases because the council had sealed them away sparked outrage on dozens of worlds, and protests began demanding the quarantine be lifted, or at minimum that humanitarian aid be allowed through. The council tried to suppress the information and threatened media outlets, but the story had taken on a life of its own, and too many people had seen the truth, and public pressure became impossible to ignore. 3 months after Katie reached Megan, the council announced they would allow limited humanitarian aid into Sector 9, and they sent medical teams and supplies and evacuation ships for those who wanted to leave. Megan chose to stay and help coordinate the aid efforts, and Katie stayed with her because they had been separated too long and would not be separated again. News of what happened reached Station Arcturus, and the story of Commander Lyria's sacrifice spread among the crew, and many began questioning orders they had followed without thought, and wondering if they too might need to choose between duty and conscience. Ember and Ash were eventually released from custody, because even the council recognized that punishing innocent dragons would create more problems than it solved, and the twin dragons returned to their home world, where they told Lyria's story to their kind. The dragons remembered, and they spread word across the galaxy about an elf commander who had chosen love over law and who had paid the ultimate price so that a mother could reach her daughter. Years passed, and Katie and Megan remained in Sector 9 working to rebuild what the plague had destroyed, and they never forgot the elf who made it all possible. Katie would tell Megan's children and later her grandchildren about Commander Lyria, who proved that even in a vast, cold, bureaucratic galaxy, there were still beings who valued compassion more than convenience, and who understood that some things mattered more than orders. And in dragon lairs across countless worlds, Ember and Ash and their descendants kept Lyria's memory alive, and they watched for others who showed the same courage, because they knew the galaxy would always need people willing to stand against injustice. The council eventually fell, because systems built on abandoning the vulnerable cannot stand forever, and new governments rose that remembered the lessons of the quarantine and of the elf commander who defied them. But long before any of that, Lyria died on a metal platform in an execution chamber, believing she had saved one person, and in doing so, she had lit a spark that would eventually burn down the very system that killed her. Her sacrifice proved that a single act of courage could change the galaxy, and that love was the most powerful force in the universe, and that those who gave everything for others would never truly die because their memory would live on in the hearts of everyone they touched. Katie Morgan grew old watching her daughter become a leader in the rebuilding efforts and seeing her grandchildren grow up free, and she never stopped being grateful for the elf who chose to help a desperate human, even though it cost her everything. And sometimes on quiet nights when the twin suns set over the crystal forests that had begun growing again on Valterra Prime, Katie would look up at the stars and whisper thank you to a commander she had known for only days, but who had given her back her future. Commander Lyria was gone, but her legacy remained, and it reminded everyone who heard her story that the measure of a life was not in how long it lasted, but in what you were willing to sacrifice for those who needed help. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, dragons flew free, carrying stories of courage and love, and reminding the galaxy that there would always be heroes willing to pay the ultimate price for what they knew was right.